Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. My friend, Dr. Sam Spinelli. It's good to have you on here. And for those watching on Spotify, the video, and maybe if you actually get these up on YouTube, we'll see that glorious mustache. Doctor of physical therapy, certified strength and conditioning coach, co-founder of multiple fitness businesses, gym owner in Kelowna, and two-time speaker at my conference here at Edmonton. Great to have you back.
Oh man, honored to be here. Thank you.
Good. I'm really glad to get you on this like earlier rush of the new podcast format. They've been doing great. I just had, for anybody who loves the physio side of stuff, I just had Adam Meekins released. And so everybody will love that. But let's get to you. So I definitely want to dive big time into injury rehabilitation here. And you yourself seem to be a magnet for injuries. You just tore your hamstring, right?
Yeah. Partial tear. So
Partial tear.
that's fun.
And we'll have some fun with this because you'd think like someone with your level of education would be like, well, people would think, well, shouldn't you be able to like not get injured, right? So what's the truth of that? Like, can you bulletproof yourself and get injuries despite all your knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's like an incredible question. And at the end of the day, it's an unfortunate answer of bulletproofing is just bullshit. And like sure, I love the idea of it, but it's not reality. I think in the best case scenario, what we can do is minimize injuries, which is, there's a big shift now in a lot of the research world to push towards the terms injury reduction, not injury prevention,
Mhm.
because it gets misinterpreted. At the end of the day, like if we reduce injuries, we are technically preventing injuries because an injury that could have happened is now prevented. So we're decreasing the overall incidence of these. But I think people don't view it that way. And so that's where like the shift in the terminology has been pushed. And yeah, like am I more injury prone than someone else? Definitely possible. I don't actually think so. Like if you look at the data on injuries per hours of doing different activities, I get injured on par or less than some people. It's just unfortunately, I'm kind of dumb and I also do a lot of stuff. And when you combine those two things together, it's probably not the ideal scenario. But yeah, like if you look at the average amount of injuries per 1,000 hours for track and field, which is how I hurt my hamstring, it's on par. I probably did things not in the best way of going and starting to do a ton of high velocity work without having spending some time to build up to it. That was dumb, but it's also fun. And I'll recover, I'll be fine, move on. Then otherwise, yeah, I've been fortunate, not a ton of injuries, but good learning lessons.
This is something that we see a lot in pro sports where early season, I think NFL football, there's a lot of hamstring injuries early in the season. So you alluded to this, I'll say it outright. It's like this is a load management problem, right? Too much intensity, too much volume, too fast.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head there. Like we see the largest incidence of injuries across the season in the preseason. Whatever sport you basically pick, that's where it is, preseason or early season. And is it load management? It's probably basically that, where, yeah, like everyone comes into the season or the preseason not having done a lot of things. And so then they then accumulate a lot really quickly and something bad happens. What exactly bad is going to happen? And so the challenge is like, okay, ideally, people, ease into things at a more progressive rate, which, like in the case of something like, let's say, American football, not so easy. Obviously, you're not going to play American football like year round, challenging, at least to the same level. But we could probably, have similar-ish stressors for a longer period of time leading into it, not get as out of shape out of season, stuff like that. Or at least in my case, if I had spent like a month ramping up in intensity before going for a max effort sprint, that would have been smart.
There's another thing I often think. So for anybody who will like, go watch you lift, you are freakishly strong. It's fun to watch, like the weights that I've seen you moving, right? And you participate in a broad spectrum of sports. So I think we generally believe that a broad spectrum of things, if the load management is appropriate and you can recover from it, is actually a good, robust array of stressors, right? You'd think that at least in theory that would mitigate injury risk. We see a lot of that talk in like youth specialization sports. Okay, so, but I've also definitely observed, certainly I feel like, and this is anecdotal, that the strongest people I know, especially if they're really like tendinous strong relative to their structure, because you're also very tall, then I feel like the injury rates, at least anecdotally, seem like they're a lot higher, but maybe it's just selection bias of the people who are competing at a lot of the things because they're the elite people. So, and my theory has always been, okay, there's going to be a weak point in the chain here. And if you're moving, like your body's being subjected to crazy absolute force, like absolute load, then the weak point is probably still going to be a smaller joint structure versus say a larger muscle or bone. So is there anything to that, or is that just self-selection bias?
Yeah, I think it's gonna unfortunately be a case of like what the activity we're looking at probably is because, just at face value, depending upon whether we're talking about something that's gonna be higher velocity versus slower velocity, that's gonna bias different types of tissues. We don't see, for instance, something like a ACL tear happen in activities that are really slow typically. It is where, your muscles didn't have time to contract quickly enough to offload that, and therefore the load gets shifted towards your ACL. In contrast, in something like a really slow-based injury, it's going to be more likely to involve the muscle or possibly the tendon. And then also aspects of, what angle are we doing different movements at, and what is the degree of joint angle? Because that might tend to encourage a certain muscle or region of that muscle to contract at a higher rate. And that might then, challenge a certain part of it that could bias that muscle. For instance, if you look at something like sprinting, how someone contacts the ground and the positions of their legs can decide to a degree, are we more likely to experience like a distal injury, or are we more likely to experience like an avulsion injury more proximally in the hamstring?
Can you
And
define what
so,
those are for the listeners who may not know? Distal and avulsion.
yeah, so when we're looking at the hamstring, you got this big bad boy that's running down the length of your back of your thigh. And distally is the further part, more close to your knee. And we see, for instance, in athletes like, for instance, Usain Bolt, he had a distal hamstring tear during the 11 World Championships, something like that. And you can see a video of it in slow motion. Great example there. And he didn't do anything technically wrong. He was just having this really fast turnover. His leg kicked out. He hadn't even hit the ground yet with his foot. It was just extending really quickly. So it was a rapid eccentric action, and then it tore. In contrast, what we see in some incidences where an athlete, for instance, overstrides, and so then their foot contacts more in front of them, that can bias more loading on the proximal or the close portion, so the upper part of your hamstring. And when that happens, sometimes we see this thing called an avulsion tear or an avulsion fracture, where the muscle actually rips off from the bone. And so it involves like the tendon. Sometimes the actual bone can break in half too, and so then it takes some of the bone with it. Yeah, not a fun time.
I guess this discussion of injuries, because you said something earlier about the frequency of injuries. And on previous podcasts, I know we've discussed this. Injuries happen roughly, they're measured in number of injuries per 1,000 hours.
Mhm.
And to make it explicit, like things like strength training or proxies for it, which, CrossFit, powerlifting, bodybuilding stuff, they tend to come in at about 1.5 to about 4 injuries per 1,000 hours. And these are not all serious injuries, right? They're not necessarily ACL tears, full thickness tears of rotator cuffs, et cetera. A lot of them are fairly minor. Now, what we're also alluding to is, and I think maybe here's the answer. Injury rates are higher in competitive sport than they are during recreational practice level activities. So maybe that's just it.
That's a very interesting one because the answer to that is not always. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think like a very interesting comparison of that is when you look at the number of injuries per 1,000 hours for something like a rec league soccer.
Hmm.
So, intramurals, for instance, versus professional soccer, they're not dramatically different.
Okay.
And yeah, an interesting part of that, I think you're talking about selection bias earlier. That might be due to, the bias of who is participating because, professional athletes, they're well-trained, fit individuals pushing themselves to this really high effort level. And on the flip side, we've got, when it comes to rec league soccer, less fit individuals, probably not taking as good of care of themselves, sometimes coming off the couch. And so, interestingly, though, we don't see dramatically different injuries in that same population or in same activity, but different populations.
I think another place that shows up is in marathon running. And I think that amateur runners have higher rates when they're running marathons
That,
than like elite athletes as well. So that makes sense because
yeah,
they're still competing. So let's say like gym level stuff versus competition level. I mean, from what I've seen, and you again are the expert on this, I would expect the injury rates to be higher because you're literally pushing yourself to the edge. And I can see in a rec league, like a beer league, older guy wants to try to do what he did 15 years ago, into the season early and is pushing too hard. And ends up snapping something, right?
Yeah, I do totally agree with that. I think in the context of like lifting, you've got like I own a gym, like you mentioned earlier, and we've got this group of middle-aged guys that come in and lift together, and they're not going ham, they're not like going crazy on it. They're there, they're having a good time, they're getting a good pump in, but they're not, pushing max reps or anything like that. And in contrast, yeah, like they probably experience less injuries than the average person because of that, or a competitive lifter. But then in these other sports where you've got individuals who go kind of hard in the relative sense because they want to relive their glory days or something like that, and they push well beyond what they're probably capable of. And yeah, so I do think in the case of lifting, that's a good example there. Marathon training, another is interesting. Like, there's a recent meta-analysis where they were looking at, the incidence of injuries for training, and they found that those who ran less, like there was a cutoff point, but it was actually pretty low. It was like 25 kilometers per week, I believe. If you ran less than that, you were more likely to experience an injury than someone who ran more than 25 kilometers. And the point at which before the injury rate actually increased was like quite dramatic. Like it was like from 25 kilometers per week to 100 kilometers per week, the rate of injuries was relatively steady. It's once you passed 100 that it started to go up.
I
Yeah.
think all this stuff really comes down to load management in the grand scheme of things, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's it's oversimplification, I suppose, but what we talked about defines it.
Yeah, yeah. I think load management is going to be very unique to the individual. Like I've got a coach here at the gym who's training for the Vancouver Marathon right now, and he has like a minor toe injury that came up, and part of it was that he's looking to go and have this relatively quite high performance given his training ability or training duration,
Hmm.
and with it, he recently decided that he was going to increase all of his training volume to get more out of it and he didn't do a crazy amount of training when you look at what a lot of marathon runners do as an average, but relative to his prior abilities, he kind of escalated things pretty quickly. And so, for him as an individual, it was too much too soon. Whereas, if he was a higher level marathon runner who had been doing this for like years and years, he probably could have got to where he was pretty quickly with minimal issues.
And one of the things that I got into is I've written articles about this, and you'll know better than me is when you make a jump in volume, that's about 1.5 like 1.5 times the amount that has been sort of the average across the previous weeks. Anything larger than that does increase your injury risk, and it sounds like exactly what he just did, right? That
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
guarantee injury, but it just increases risk.
Yeah, exactly. Like at face value, if you like, step back and you had that conversation with most people, you're like, hey, I want you to double how much you're doing this week. They'd be like, that sounds probably not the smartest choice, but we do it all the time.
Okay, so what can we do to mitigate risk outside of what we just talked about?
Yeah, like I think number one, without a doubt, most important thing is like living a relatively healthy lifestyle. And I know it's not super sexy, but like working on your sleep, your overall stress, getting in general physical activity because we can get into like the more nuanced and fun things that do make a difference, but we consistently see that those who are healthier, and that's a vague, terminology, but at the end of the day, people who have less relative comorbidities and markers of illness, those people get injured and experience pain less. Pretty much anything that you pick on that topic, they have less injuries for. And so then if we check that off, then we can start talking about the fun things. And that's where it's like we see relatively frequent exposure to consistent training beneficial, likely a good return on investment for getting stronger. So getting after some consistent compound primary movement training as a baseline. If you look at, there's a study investigating the reflection of a one rep max strength or similar um, measures on back squat and then the incidence of injuries in NCAA athletes. And basically, there was an association, and a reasonable one, of that those who had a stronger 1RM got injured less often. And it was across pretty much all injuries, which is an interesting concept. And then, when we look at past that, it gets a bit more fine-tuned because what are you looking to do specifically? And that sort of guides probably the unique nature of what you might want to do from a preparation standpoint, because what we want to ideally do is examine your relative goals and see what I is going to be stressed to the most degree, and then prepare you for that in as many ways as possible. And so like there's the side of doing that activity and building up progressively, both in intensity, volume, specificity, but then also on the other side, activities in the gym that might supplement and support that. Like for instance, again, in the world of like running, sprinting, track and field, etc. Yeah, I probably want to challenge your hamstrings in a robust way, performing some high effort and intensity, deep full range of motion, hip extension, knee flexion work. Um, in other activities like overhead throwing sports, I probably want to challenge your shoulder through some sort of rotational basis, some extreme ranges of shoulder flexion in an eccentric way. And those two things very different depending upon what activity you're going to do. Like a sprinter, they don't need to do that shoulder stuff. Could they? Sure. But it's like sprinters aren't really hurting their shoulders. They're not blowing them out. They don't have this high demand on it. On the flip side, sometimes sprinters or sometimes throwing athletes, they might need to do that stuff for their hamstring, but it's less important than it might be for the direct shoulder work. And so as we start to get past like level one, making sure that you're a really healthy individual overall. Level two, good compound generalized training program across, most fundamental levels. And then level three would be isolating down on more specific concepts based upon what your unique needs and goals are.
I'm going to give the brohards a little bit of a layman's example of this. Let's say I like doing preacher curls on a bench. I like single arm machine preacher curls, but you're pretty strong at dumbbell curls anyway. I think about it as I want to graduate my exposure to a new position and load on the tendon, the bicep tendon in that position. So one of the things I wouldn't do is go right to the heaviest curl I possibly could if you haven't done preachers in that, let's say, macro cycle. So I like to actually ease into that and then carefully make sure that I'm very in control of that end range. And I may not actually fully straighten out my elbow, especially if someone's hypermobile. And then, make sure you tolerate it really well, watch the volume, and then progressively add load over a few sessions as opposed to going to the heaviest thing, right? Because it's a new position to put yourself in. Even if you're good at doing a bicep curl standing up where your upper arm is like, in line with your body.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like two similar activities, but they do have a distinct difference in how they stress a part of the body. And, like, could you injure your distal bicep tendon doing a standard bicep curl? Yeah, maybe, but it's more likely in a preacher curl, especially if you're pushing it really hard and you're not used to it.
And if you think about, I like thinking about, how a limb is positioned relative to a joint. I like thinking about a clock face because like bones move against the joint it's moving with relative to almost like a clock face motion, right? It's not like they can go 360 degrees. But if you change the position that your humerus, your femur is, and you're loading it pretty heavily, you're putting the muscles, whether it's hamstrings, quads, adductors, or triceps, biceps, rotator cuff, you're putting them in a different position. If you're not used to loading them when that bone is in that position relative to the joint, getting a little technical here, then I would rather make sure that I graduate the exposure to stress on the tendon and the muscle when it's in a new position it's not used to. So I think people forget that. And I just like the preacher curl example as a really easy one to visualize.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I like that clock face idea. I want to see how I can expand on that. I'm not too sure because I think the position of the limb is a huge one and really important and something that, yeah, not appreciated. And a secondary one is like the position and angle of the loading, because like from a, force standpoint, if you look at something like a preacher curl and then like a spider curl, they're kind of similar. I know it's not exactly like there's a angle change, but because where the peak demand is, like that's a big difference in it. Um, or like in the case of rotator cuff, if you look at something like a elbow on knee external rotation, when you're like sitting on a bench and then you got your knee up and you put your elbow on and you pivot off of it, versus like a cable external rotation with your arm by your side, kind of like a face pull action. Those two have very different points of the loading, even though you're general limbs are in the same position, but because the cable is not going to have almost any relative loading because it's going to be forward and front, and as you rotate back, the leverage on it is relatively low. Whereas in the dumbbell movement, the peak loading is when your hand is in the lower position, and so you experience the peak force demands at different points in the movement. And it's a important thing because, like you're pointing out, like where you experience that load is going to impact the parts of the muscle tendon interface where they'll experience more or less, and they're really not appreciated ideas.
We're definitely getting in the weeds here. So I'm going to bring it back and we'll say, just think about what you just said through the lens of injuries happen when force exceeds tissue tolerance. And there's going to be different
Boom.
forces acting on different positions across a movement, right? So if you're just not used to it, and if there's a particular point that just feels really stressful, and again, going back to that preacher curl, where do you feel the stress? In this extended position, that actually feels quite stressful, right? Let's use another example. If you're doing like a pec deck fly or a dumbbell flies, I don't love dumbbell flies because I think that
See, exactly. Yeah,
the
another one.
let's define this. So the resistance profile of the exercise is how the force acts on you. Your strength curve is how strong you are in the different positions across the motion. You have a lot of force acting on you in the fully extended position because gravity's acting more there at the top. There's almost no resistance. But you're weakest where the force is acting the most, which means that there's a mismatch between the strength curve and the resistance profile. So it doesn't make for a super great exercise. I would rather have something like a pec deck fly, which evens it
Hmm.
out a lot more. But you have to think about, all right, where is going to be the most force acting across that motion so you don't load it for, where it's hard at the easiest point for you. You got to
Hmm.
look at it. I want to make sure I don't fuck this up because the brain fuck I've been dealing with lately has been messing with me. You got to load appropriately to probably the hardest position, which the problem with then exercises like a dumbbell fly is then you're not necessarily getting a lot of tension through the rest of it. There's ways that you can modify the stuff, but we're getting in the weeds.
Hmm.
Okay, let's pull us back. Okay, in the event of an injury, because they definitely happen, you've had more than your fair share. Do people need MRIs or other imaging when it comes to injuries?
Okay, so the short answer is in the vast majority of cases, no. A image, MRI, X-ray, whatever you want to pick, is either A, unnecessary, B, not helpful, and C, can actually make things worse. Now, that can confuse a lot of people, but the reality is that if you have whatever injury we want to pick, outside of a few rarer instances, if we know that blank tissue is involved, unless it requires surgery, which is actually not that common in the vast majority of things, it doesn't necessarily guide what we should be doing. We're looking at where are you weak? Where are you limited in motion? What do we need to develop to get you back to the functional activities that are meaningful to you? And then how can we find exercises that match up accordingly to that? That's the bulk of what best rehab and training honestly is. Past that, having direct imaging reports for guiding treatment doesn't really help a lot. Like it might, but in the vast majority of cases, we can't necessarily choose an exercise based upon this minor detail of involvement versus that. It doesn't really line up that way. And then the follow-up to that is that just because you do have these imaging reports, we don't necessarily know that that's what's guiding your symptoms. In a lot of cases, they could be irrelevant. It could have been there before. It could not be why you're experiencing pain. We know from large, robust data sets on looking at a wide range of populations that we can find individuals who have a rotator cuff tear and complain about it, have a rotator cuff tear on their other side and do not complain about it. Super common. I just recently had an individual who reached out to me. This person was very frustrated with things. We were discussing and doing a consultation about what their course of treatment would look like. They have they live in America and they have access to going and getting these imaging reports done. And I said, I don't think that you need this. I don't think it's going to guide anything. The whole spiel I just gave you. And they said, okay, well, I really want to go for this. And they went, they got it done, and it showed that they had nothing involved. They had no tissue damage at all. And they were very upset, honestly. And now that's not the most common case, but it does happen. But on the flip side, a different scenario that happens is that someone gets their MRI report or whatever image it is, and they read it, and it sounds scary as hell. Like whatever it may be, it might not even be that intensive from a standpoint of like medical terminology, but the average person doesn't know what they're reading, and it sounds terrifying. And that can make things dramatically worse. And we actually have research showing that when you give people MRI reports, they are more likely to actually have a persistence of their symptoms for a longer duration of time. They're more likely to catastrophize and increase their symptoms. And at the end of the day, unless it's necessary to guide the next step, such as surgery or, adjacent treatments, like maybe you need to have some sort of injection, X, Y, or Z, it's not going to be all that beneficial. So yeah, generally I try to discourage people unless I see a reason to go get it.
Is part of the problem that people just want a clear-cut answer because these things are never clear-cut, and then they think, well, if I have the clear-cut answer, this thing is wrong, I can go have surgery, and that thing can get fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was just recently at a local hockey game, and there was an advertisement for one of the local imaging places. It's a private one, and they were like, "Come get an MRI and find out what's going on inside your body." And it's like that is very misleading, and I can see why people fall into the trap of it. Like you think like it's going to give you this idea of what's actually happening internally. I understand the concept of it. It's just human bodies are not that simple.
I'm guessing, like, I mean, I'll be 47 now in 9 days, so I'll be 47 by the time this airs. And I don't always feel it. Sometimes I really do. But I'm sure if you put me in a full body scan, you would definitely find something wrong with my left shoulder. And like I manage it okay. Who knows what they might find in my right shoulder? It's generally asymptomatic. Might look at my lower back. I've never had any sort of history of back issues. At my age, wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of quote degeneration at that point. We're degenerative at this point anyway. It's just the language gets scary. My right
Exactly.
knee has been doing mostly good. There's certain things that still doesn't love, but thanks to your like literally, I'll give you guys a good example. I had you taught a seminar. Had you look at my knee. You did a whole bunch of tests. You're pretty sure it was probably a grade one ACL sprain, maybe a corner post injury, if I recall correctly. But just hearing that, and then some of the stuff you told me to do, changed my fears about the nature of it. And I felt confident about what I could do. And I can, the other day I was doing deficit reverse lunges with 90-pound dumbbells. And I still sometimes feel the need, like body weight squat bilaterally, body weight. My knee feels really tentative. It's strange. But 90-pound Bulgarians, 90-pound reverse lunges into a deficit, no big deal whatsoever. If I'm wearing my knee sleeves and I do a pendulum squat machine, I've got all that external reference of support of that much stability. And, 4 plates on that, not a big deal. It feels hard, but my knees are really cool with it. But a body weight squat without any additional support doesn't like it very much. But again, what do? I go do all this shit that feels fine.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And like, let's just say you went and got imaging done and it came back and says, okay, Andrew, you have a, posterior corner injury. What are you going to do about it? Like, is it going to change anything?
Still got to follow the rehab instructions anyway, right? My
Yeah.
guess is a lot of people would be fearful of the injury and probably avoid doing some of the things that they need to do. And the Adam Meekins podcast, we talk a lot about, uh, the importance of, basically strengthening things. And we dispense with a lot of the passive modalities, as at least your primary mechanism. I think passive stuff can be really valuable. Okay, so what about your own injury rehab here? Like, how are you going about this hamstring injury rehab? What have you done in the past with injuries through the lens of the principles of injury rehabilitation you would take any clients through?
Yeah. So the first thing I did was I started with an assessment. I wanted to get an insight into like, okay, where am I at from a mobility standpoint? Where am I at from a strength standpoint? How's my power? Some of those larger global qualities. And then specifically in the context of hamstring, there's some research that points that by doing palpation where we feel the area and mark what is quote unquote like involved, because I literally did tear my hamstring in this case. And what they do is they mark the point where it starts to hurt and then where it feels better. And so you get an idea of how much of the hamstring might be involved. And then you actually take a measurement of that. And then it gives you like an approximation on timeline to rehab. At the end of the day, like I did it because I was just curious about the insight. It doesn't change anything that I did. So it's kind of like the imaging. But, I went through this full process to get some insight into where I'm at. And then I created a structure of exercises to then target and address these things to get me back to where I want to be. So, for instance, I was limited in the ability to flex my hip and then straighten my knee, particularly in a combination because my hamstring was involved and it does those actions. So then it would be lengthened in those positions. So then I selected movements that challenged me to be able to do that in a slow and progressive way. And then I targeted exercises from a strengthening standpoint that would allow me to do some hip extension. So, extending that hip. And I started off in easier options, so something like a glute bridge. And then I've been slowly scaling that up to more challenging options. So, like just the other day, I started to do a single leg deadlift essentially with some support. And then I'll progress into full single leg deadlifts, and then I'll start to do probably a wide variety of different hinge movements. And then in addition, I'm doing some leg curls because that directly works the hamstrings. And as I get better, I'm gonna increase the intensity, so how effortfully I'm contracting based upon my symptoms. So if I'm doing anything and distinctly hurts, I'm gonna back off. Whereas if it feels okay, I'm gonna keep progressing. And then I also want to try to contract faster. And, I heard it's sprinting and I want to try to get back to sprinting. So, just yesterday I did some speed walking, which was a total blast. And I'm just gonna, do a little bit of faster walking. And then once I feel ready to do a jog, I'll do some jogging and then gradually just scale up that level of effort. I'll probably start off with like a 50% jog and then work my way up every session until I get back to pretty full effort. And then I'll slow things down because at some point I'm gonna get to what would be a more traditional training program. And the general overarching concept is like similar to what you were discussing before of easing into things. And so I look at where I want to get to, and then I'm reverse engineering and saying, okay, this is what I can currently do. What can I choose that will help get me to that point? And trying to select movements that ease me into it, allow me to graduate in my exposure to things that are challenging and maybe uncomfortable, and decrease my fear about them, but also increase the capacity and tolerance I have with them. Like the idea of sprinting right now petrifies me. I am genuinely scared that that thing is just going to snap in half again. So I need to, choose some movements that will ease me into it, make sure that I'm more confident in that hamstring and know that it should be okay. And then the same idea applies to whatever you might pick. Like if you hurt your back deadlifting, yeah, we're probably gonna, modify the way that you lift things temporarily. Try to then develop some more comfort and strength in your back, making sure that you feel confident in it as we ease back into full lifting.
You made me think of something there, and I mean, a Nordic hamstring curl would not be appropriate for your hamstrings at this point. However, I'm seeing stuff, and I haven't had a chance to deep dive yet, but I'm getting the impression there was a while where there was all this buzz about Nordic hamstring curls being this great prophylactic injury preventative thing, exposure to tension on hamstrings. And now all of a sudden I'm seeing a lot of stuff that they're saying, no, 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 no. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I think the challenge with this is that there's always this evolution of science and how we look at things. And part of it was that they were, doing the research on this and maybe not utilizing the best methodology for the statistics side of things. So, do Nordic hamstring curls provide a, injury reductive effect? Most likely they do it. Absolutely. Like when you apply a, program focusing on Nordic hamstring curls to a population of athletes, they get injured less. I don't think anyone's going to reasonably argue with that. The challenge is like, how much do they reduce it? Are they better than other options? And then do they fully reduce them or, quote unquote, prevent injuries? And I think like at the end of the day, the Nordic hamstring curl cannot prevent every injury from occurring. It is a exercise that can provide some value, decrease injuries to a degree, but if you're sprinting at maximum velocity, it can't stop that from tearing. Like it's gonna possibly happen, and I think that's part of the disagreement with it. And like there's a main researcher who's been pushing back against it, Franco Imperizelli. I may have messed his name up. Yeah, he's Italian. Very nice guy though. Um, and he was highlighting that the statistics that were utilized in the research on it were like maybe not the best. And when he reran a lot of the research on it, it still shows that it could be beneficial. It's just not as much. It was like overclaimed and overpreached. So, like people give that comment exactly because, if anyone's ever met me, I'm pretty strong. And I'm fortunate that I actually have a lot of dynamometry and force testing, all these fun toys at my facility. And one of them is called a Nord board. And it's basically like this device where I can set up to do a Nordic. My legs get hooked in, and then I do a Nordic, and it can tell how much force I'm actually creating. And then the fun thing about it from a competitive standpoint is that it gives you normative data. So you like put in your age and whatever else, and it tells you how you compare to your peers. And I'll tell you what, I'm in the 100th percentile in that sucker. So like as far as like people go, I've got some beastly strong hamstrings, and I still tore it sprinting. And it's just at the end of the day, I do think that it does decrease injuries during sprinting. It's just I can't do all of them. And the best thing is to gradually ease into sprinting, which is not what I did.
I mean, I'm kind of hoping people understand what we're talking about. Like, I think with the enthusiasts and the coaches, they'll know what Nordic hamstring curls are, I suppose. So we should probably describe what they are. So you're on your knees, your feet are locked in, and then you are extending forward. Now, most people, just the act of doing the eccentric, that's greater than your one rep capability. Most people cannot curl back up again. So here's a key part of it is again, there's a self-selection, someone who's stronger anyway, who can do that eccentric, then the load management side comes back into play. Is it an appropriate load and stressor relative to where that person is? So there's a certain portion of people that simply just aren't going to be able to do it at all, or they're going to need assistance with it, right? They hold on to something that will actually help them bear some of their body weight. But I would suspect that part of the issue with this is the people who are already strong enough are the ones who actually do Nordic hamstring curls. So they're probably ahead of the game on the strength side of stuff for injury preventative. And then I wonder, is there some potential risk to people who aren't really strong enough to do it in the first place, where it's poor load management for stress on the hamstrings, which actually may acutely increase the risk of an injury. I suppose that's a relevant issue too, right? So I don't feel comfortable anymore broadly saying, hey, this is a good thing for everybody. But that's just exercise selection anyway.
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely agree with you. It's probably that there's a effect similar to like a bell curve shape where people who are weaker or inverse bell curve shape, people who are weaker probably have an increased risk of injury performing the movement because, they don't have sufficient strength on it and it could be overloading to their hamstrings to such a degree, or they just don't get any effect from it because they just flop and they don't even try on it because it's too hard. Whereas the middle group, they probably see some benefit from it. It challenges them appropriately, it gives them some positive stimulus to improve their hamstring strength and eccentric control. Great things. And then finally, there's like the top end people who either don't get much benefit from it. Um, Maybe there's an increased risk of it because they're going so hard on it. That's a possibility. Yeah. Interestingly, like to the point you said of like not just tossing it out there, I recently had a runner hire me to help them with their overall training program. Like I'm their run coach, I'm their lifting coach, and they sent me what their prior coach had them doing. And from like a lifting standpoint, they were doing 3 sets of 10 on Nordic hamstring curls 3 times a week. And I was like, what the hell is this?
That's a lot
That
of volume.
sounds. And
Yeah.
I was like, how can you tell me how this was going? They're like, I basically sit up and fall. I'm like, okay, not sure that's having the effect we were looking for.
Let's pivot to back pain myths. Quote, your back is fragile and needs to be protected. Quote, deadlifts are dangerous. Right? We encounter that sort of shit a lot. So is there a relationship between posture, back pain? What thoughts on any of this stuff?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, like there's definitely a relationship. It's just not as straightforward as people think. Like if you say, okay, you said posture. If I sit
Yeah.
here in this position where I have a more slouched posture for a long duration of time, could it hurt? Absolutely. But the same thing could be said if I sit here for a long time in a really extended upright posture, that could hurt too. If I stay in any singular position for a long enough point, I'm probably going to experience some discomfort with it. The best situation is probably to move and adjust and play around with different positions. And could I be sensitized to just one of those anyways? Yeah, like some people just don't tolerate slouching to a great degree, but it doesn't mean that's the case for everybody. Like there's a chance that slouching could be something that you currently don't find a good position, but you're probably able to do it previously, and you might be able to do it again in the future. Just like at this moment, it doesn't feel great. And that might mean you benefit from a quote unquote like postural intervention where we temporarily try to change to minimize your time being in a such posture. But the difference, I think, from how it used to be approached, which was that we blame the posture. We say slouching is bad and you should never do it. Instead is that let's try to adjust and move away from that position for a while you get back and we decrease your symptoms and you feel better with things, then we ease back into it. That's more of the newer way that I think evidence is guiding us towards. And a similar concept applies with deadlifts. Like deadlifts are a great option for challenging so many tissues in your back, your hips, your thighs. Can you take them too far? Sure. Like you said earlier, if you take any tissue past what it can tolerate, something bad's going to happen. Now, what might break down? Who knows? Could be a wide range of things. It's going to depend upon how strong you are at all these different areas. And that's not unique, though, to the deadlift. Like, if I have you do anything, it could be like, most people probably think walking is good for you. And I totally agree. But if you go and walk for 24 hours straight and you're used to walking for 10 minutes, yeah, something bad's going to happen. Like,
That's
unfortunately.
load management again. Everything comes back to load management, right? It's terrible load management of walking, even though it's like theoretically low impact.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the challenge is like, how do we find that sweet balance? What is right for you? And by doing an activity, there's an interesting challenge that comes whenever we do any sort of activities that as we do the activity, we likely improve how much of that activity we can do. Fact, like you look at, how long you been deadlifting for, do you think? 30 years?
You know what's funny is
I don't
I
know when you
probably wasn't
started.
doing as much of it in the early days of lifting as I really got influenced by the bro split
Yeah.
magazine stuff. So I've probably been more active at deadlifting for, it's been not quite 20 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 20 years ago, you were probably less comfortable deadlifting as you are now. Like at the end of the day, you've been doing it more. You might not be able to do more. You're a beast in your younger years. We'll give you some credence there. But at the end of the day, like we see that there's tends to be improvements in how much someone can do, how well they're familiar with it, all these things. On the flip side, as you do something, we talked about injuries earlier, that it's like X injuries per 1,000 hours. Well, as you do more, you're accumulating more hours. And so then at some point, like you might experience an injury because of that. And it's not that the activity was inherently bad, you just were doing it, and eventually something's going to happen. And I think that's like sort of this interesting conundrum of where as you do it, you improve your capacity with it, all these good things happen. But on the flip side, there's the exposure challenge that where you could get injured doing it.
And I mean, in my specific example, I haven't pulled, a conventional deadlift crazy heavy in a while, in large part because a couple of years ago I sustained a sort of an odd and yet not fully understood bicep injury in my left arm, and that is usually the arm that I go underhand with on the deadlift where I have strongest grip, right? I don't mess around with hook grip. And so I was sort of loosely diagnosed as having a cervical radiculopathy, which is, I mean, you could
Mm.
define better than me what that's involved with. But anyway, I was having some nerve issues with my left arm, and there's still some sort of like, it was almost like a hollow spot in my left bicep. And whenever I go really crazy with like heavily loaded underhand gripping of stuff, let's say like I do a heavy RDL, then I feel it there. So my concern is, well, if I, and again, it would be just appropriate load management, gradually build up, gradually build up. I haven't been conventionally deadlifting in a long time. If I did and I went too far too fast based on what my posterior change glutes, back, hamstrings could handle, then I would be concerned that I would rip my bicep clean off. So I just don't do that, right? But it also doesn't meet my training goals or my recovery goals right now because of all the other stuff I do. So for me, a big deadlift, once upon a time, that was a lot of fun. Absolutely loved it. It hasn't been a big priority for me. But there's also narratives that I've just woven. And I always draw people back to the narratives about why we don't do things. And I've watching as I'm slowly becoming that older guy who, well, I used to be able to bench this, but now my shoulder, I used to be able to squat this because of my knee. Hey, I used to be able to deadlift this. Hey, my bicep. And you kind of chuckle as your training evolves. So you kind of understand it. So I just try not to, talk in front of the younger guys, be like, well, in my day, I used to do this, right? So I just try to dispense with being that person.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you just mentioned that. Like we were talking about pain previously and injuries, and there's this concept called the inactivism or inactivist approach to pain. And basically it looks to how we interact with our environment and the choices we make and how those things then reflectively impact the pain that we experience. And part of it is that as you experience X issue, you take Y action to either A, minimize experiencing that pain again, because that's basically how humans function. And then you choose to make all these choices that then actually further limit how prepared you are for that pain because you're essentially avoiding it. And so, like, yeah, if you tried to go do a heavy deadlift, you're less prepared than you were 5 years ago. It doesn't technically it doesn't matter in this case because like you're not looking to go back and do it. But it's just this interesting idea of how we kind of naturally self-regulate in these things.
Mm.
And in some cases, it doesn't matter like this. On other cases, it can be problematic. I have individuals all the time who come and they tell me about X, Y, or Z injury, and then I look at how they choose to move and they take on a pattern of motion that really like avoids a loading a certain region, and then that region gets loaded when they were doing something, and it makes sense. Like you look at someone who hurt their knee and they take on a way of moving that's really biased towards hip and ankle motion instead of utilizing their knee, and then they get challenged in doing something like a heavy squat and they get forced to actually have a more knee dominant action, and then it hurts them, and they think that the problem is the squat versus the way that they were opting to move and minimize developing that region. It's just like an interesting thought process.
So a couple of things here. First is, and I've alluded to this, with the nature of my injuries that have just accumulated over time, I've modified my training to be able to still train. I still like heavy Romanian deadlifts. I like, heavy dumbbells, barbell, a lot of single leg RDL type stuff. Good. So I'm getting the exposure to that, that deadlifting motion. When it comes to, I haven't been barbell squatting in a while, pendulum squat, a lot of heavy, heavy single leg stuff. That stuff's been pretty good, right? And a bunch of other things, even leg extensions. Like that stuff is still getting the knee joint and the muscles related a lot of exposure. When it comes to, hey, I don't barbell press anymore, a lot of people just kind of phase that out anyway. Heavy chest pressing machines, heavy shoulder pressing machines, dumbbells, etc. That stuff all fits. Now, also, you and me sound like we're pretty beaten up if anybody's listening here, but guess what we're doing is we're still lifting. We're still, I have pretty good metabolic health, probably the best ever because I've been doing more cardio. I'm sure you're doing great on that. My experience of feeling fit and active is really good relative to where I am in life. I've been able to keep doing these things. I didn't just decide, all right, I don't want to ever get hurt again. I'm going to stop lifting. This is part of my identity, and I've just shifted stuff around, and that's an important skill. So, yeah, we've had injuries, but these injuries didn't actually like stop us from doing anything that matters. We've just pivoted tactics, and I think that's an important way to look at it.
Yeah, I'd say like number one, your injuries don't define you. I think a lot of times people will let that happen though, and that could be a challenge. Then also, at the end of the day, like these injuries can, in some cases, be a mere blip on the radar, but you let them persist into something greater. Or it can be the case of where like you have this thing that actually is possibly more challenging issue to work through and overcome. But then again, people understandably don't want to do that. Like for myself, I have a condition called FAI, which is like a bony abnormality in my hip, femoral acetabular impingement. So it's basically like I have extra bone growth on one of my hips. And when I go into like a very deep range for certain motions, I feel this like extreme pinch in my hip. But I've had this since I was like 17 years old, has not changed. And you know, I know that I selectively avoid certain movements and have this bias away from certain positions and challenges. But then I fortunately have like people around me who remind me to address certain details because I have a tendency of like when I go to train, I avoid certain things because it can hurt. But then there are ways that I can supplement that to make sure that I'm more prepared and able to accessory work around that issue, so to speak. And it's not a super fun thing to do, but then it allows you to still be relatively prepared for a lot of things because, yeah, like, sure, I've had a reasonable amount of injuries in my past, but like you said, I still try to get after it. I'm still looking to be a competitive weightlifter. I compete in strongman. I do endurance activities. I don't have any intentions of slowing down. I might need to regulate myself a little bit more, but I just like having fun with this stuff. So at the end of the day, as long as I'm able to, I'm gonna try to do that. I just need to be intelligent with my training and choices.
I think that's what this all comes down to. And you have access to our friend Dean Somerset, one of the smartest people when it comes to hips out there. And Dean's been on the podcast recently. As of time of recording, like I think it's tomorrow. I'll be actually at his book
Oh,
launch for his Rock Solid
oh yeah.
Resilience here in Edmonton. So I'm excited for that. I think his book is actually going to be a really good treatment of a lot of the stuff that we talk about and far more in depth. Now, don't you have something in the works too? Or share?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've been working on a book similar to like Dean. Dean and I started my book a little bit after him, so I think we're on a similar timeline for getting them done. They're a huge task. So I'm really hoping that my book will be released by the end of this year. The overall concept is trying to develop a resilient body and, working on a lot of the qualities and concepts that we talked about today. I spent a lot of time working and writing on principles and detailing a lot of the points that we've really hashed on today and provide that as a big bulk. But then additionally, there are tons of these progressions that are built into the book to take someone from really limited function in X area and take them to a high level at the end of that. And that way it walks people through and gives them guidance on, okay, maybe I don't have the best strength in my quads. How can I go from low function in that all the way up to the highest levels? And I try to walk people through that whole system, and it's from literally head to toe.
I can't wait for that one too. So, I mean, I've been got so many people I know have written books recently. I just like, had a whole bunch of stuff said to me, so I've been picking through all these things. But I'll be bringing you back right around the time that book comes out. You'll be busy, but you're coming back on, and we'll talk about that again and give it a shout and go deeper. So, I know that people can follow you at I'm scrolling at Dr. Sam Spinelli, so at Dr. Sam Spinelli. What other resources do you want to direct people to while they wait for the book?
Yeah, I've been building a new company called Rehab Explained. Goal is to try to develop a good educational resource for coaches, clinicians, so whether you are a personal trainer, strength coach, physio, chiropractor, there is something for you within it that's going to help you be able to serve people to a better degree, helping those who are in pain, those who want to train and get after it. There's a wide range of lectures, there's practicals, additional resources that are in there, and I'm constantly adding more. Every month we try to release new content. I do deep dives, Q&As, full wide range of options to help, expand people's mindsets from principle-based information all the way to directly practical. You can leave the thing and go and apply it immediately. Trying to just create a fantastic resource to help people work with individuals that are in pain, but then also more towards the performance side of things and just make the best coaches and clinicians out there possible.
All right. Everybody listening, I hope you guys will go follow Sam, check out what he's doing. Okay. He's been on before. I've got a whole bunch of old episodes with you. The old episodes where it's a bit more like business and career focused. The coaches will love that, guys. Go binge. There's a gold mine back there. Okay. For anybody listening, there's a few ways you can help me out. The podcast audience has been growing. I appreciate it. So if you're a relatively new listener, message me on Instagram. I want you there. Follow me at Andrew Coates Fitness. For anybody who's been enjoying this and you've got people in your world you like these episodes. But again, there's going to be different topics, and some of the episodes, the nutrition stuff might be your jam, and the hardcore rehab. We really got into the weeds on this one. Maybe like fought through it a little bit, but I hope there's a big payoff. Share this with someone that you know, whether it's a clinician, practitioner, coach, or someone who's been dealing with injuries. I think there's a lot of positive messaging here. You can help me there. Give me a review. I would kill for some great reviews. Those go a long way. And so I appreciate it in any way, shape, or form that helps me get this in more hands. That will let me grow this. I will keep doing these because I took a hiatus before I reformatted and I'm loving it. And I don't want to put it on hiatus again. There's no threat of that, but I can keep getting you guys 2 episodes a week if I've got great guests, great topics. And my emotional investment in this goes a long way. And seeing a 5-star review is a nice, uplifting one. The rare 1-star reviews. I think I got one on like Apple. It's just like I don't know. I don't know what that was all about, but it's like that can crush your soul. So help me with
Oh,
the 5 stars, right? You guys are great. I appreciate you. I want to hear from you guys, please. If you've never messaged me before, I really want to hear what you're thinking. And I'm going to continue to bring you great episodes, great guests. Thank you, Sam. Appreciate you.